Introduction to Azure SQL Managed Identity Issues. Azure SQL Managed Identity is a powerful feature that allows you to authenticate to Azure SQL databases without needing to manage credentials. However, like any other technology, it can have its own set of issues. In this tutorial, we will explore common issues with Azure SQL Managed Identity and provide practical solutions to overcome them. Understanding Azure SQL Managed Identity. Before diving into the issues, it is essential to understand how Azure SQL Managed Identity works. Azure SQL Managed Identity is a type of identity that is managed by Azure and can be used to authenticate to Azure SQL databases. It is created when you enable the Managed Identity feature on your Azure SQL Server or Azure SQL Managed Instance. Common issues with Azure SQL Managed Identity. One of the most common issues with Azure SQL Managed Identity is the inability to connect to the database using the managed identity. This can happen if the managed identity is not correctly configured or if the necessary permissions are not granted. Another issue is the lack of visibility into the authentication process, making it challenging to troubleshoot connectivity problems. Resolving connectivity issues. To resolve connectivity issues with Azure SQL Managed Identity, you need to ensure that the managed identity is correctly configured and that the necessary permissions are granted. This includes ensuring that the Azure SQL Server or managed instance has the correct permissions to access the database. You should also verify that the managed identity is enabled and that the Azure SQL Server or managed instance is correctly configured to use the managed identity. Best practices for using Azure SQL Managed Identity. To avoid common issues with Azure SQL Managed Identity, it is essential to follow best practices. This includes regularly reviewing and updating the managed identity configuration to ensure it remains correct and up to date. You should also monitor the authentication process to quickly identify and resolve any connectivity issues. Additionally, it is crucial to limit the use of managed identity to only the resources that require it, to minimize the attack surface and reduce the risk of unauthorized access. Conclusion. In conclusion, Azure SQL Managed Identity is a powerful feature that can simplify the authentication process to Azure SQL databases. However, like any other technology, it can have its own set of issues. By understanding the common issues with Azure SQL Managed Identity and following best practices, you can ensure a smooth and secure authentication process to your Azure SQL databases. Regularly reviewing and updating the managed identity configuration, monitoring the authentication process, and limiting the use of managed identity to only the necessary resources can help minimize the risk of connectivity issues and unauthorized access.